Hi, this is Nishanjan and I'll be going to present our work Robustifying the Multi-Scale Representation for Neural Radiance Fields. Given a location in a 3D scene, neural radiance fields use an MLP network to model the volumetric density and color at that location, and it uses a rendering scheme inspired from ray tracing literature to arrive at a color for a given pixel. Basically, it casts a ray along the view direction through the pixel into the 3D scene and then aggregates color and volumetric densities along the point sample throughout that ray and use them to arrive at a color for that pixel. Given this approach suffers from aliasing effects when rendering at different resolutions, a recently proposed multi-scale representation for these neural radiance fields involve casting cones instead of rays, and these 3D cones are then used to model the color for a pixel based on the volumetric frustum the pixel represents. These cones are approximated by multivariate Gaussians. This approach has shown impressive results on multi-scale version of Blender dataset, which consists of images at different resolutions, and it is able to render renderings with minimize aliasing effects at lower resolutions. An important assumption this approach makes is that initial camera poses are highly accurate and therefore will lead to correct camera object localization, which is not in general the case with any real world setting where the key point correspondences are noisy, and thus it will lead to incorrect object localization using this representation, and this might lead to distorted renderings. We verify this notion by adding angular deviations to the poses of the multi-scale Blender dataset, and we observe that there are high number of artifacts in the renderings produced by this approach, and thus it seems that this approach is highly vulnerable to pose errors. We now propose robustifying this multi-scale representation such that using multi-scale images and a noisy set of poses, we can arrive at a correct 3D scene structure and thereby render correct novel views. This robustification is based on handling errors in the pose domain along with estimating the structure, and which we do so by using a concept called motion averaging. So it involves firstly obtaining robust rotations using rotation averaging and then using these estimated robust rotations to for estimating translation parameters for a given image. So given an image set corresponding to a 3D scene, the relative rotations can be obtained by using noisy correspondences and epipolar geometric constraints, and these relative rotations, which would be noisy in nature, can be used to initialize a view graph, which basically is a collection of uh, absolute rotations of images and as its vertices and the relative rotations as its edges. Given we have observed value for edges of this view graph, we can take one of the vertex as a source and we can traverse from that vertex to all the other vertices and can estimate absolute rotations with respect to that source for each of the vertices. This leads to initializing a complete view graph. Now, rotation averaging uses this completely initialized view graph to minimize the discrepancy between the predicted relative poses and the observed relative poses, where the predicted relative poses are the ones which are obtained by using the initialized absolute rotations. Similar to a recent work, we also use neural networks to arrive at robust set of poses using the completely initialized view graph, and we use a message passing based graph neural network architecture to do this. It optimizes the following objective function where the first term corresponds to the rotation averaging term and the second term is just a regularizer for learning one-to-one mapping. We now analyze our pose robustification approach under a scenario where noise is added to the key point correspondence obtained for any scene. For this, we use a Lego dataset with ground truth poses available, and we use a classical SFM algorithm to estimate key point correspondences for this dataset, and then we add noise to those estimated key point correspondences. And then we use the algorithm again to estimate relative rotations and then absolute rotations. On the other hand, based on the noisy relative rotations, we apply our robustification approach to those and then estimate a different set of robust poses for the scene, and we compare both of these poses with respect to ground truth poses in this figure, and it can be observed that Our robustified poses are much better as compared to the one estimated by this SFM algorithm in presence of noisy correspondences. Given the effectiveness of our approach, we now propose a joint cost function to optimize pose and structure network parameters simultaneously, where the structure network is only updated with respect to the rendering loss, but the pose network is updated with respect to both rendering and multiple rotation averaging loss. Given the updating the pose with respect to rendering loss can be tricky, we instead use a weighted cost function for updating poses, where initially the weight of rendering cost function is kept low, which is increased over time. Given any input point and its view direction, it's first passed to a position encoding function and then through an MLP neural network to arrive at color and volumetric density for that point using the neural radiance fields approach. So therefore, given the poses are passed through this positional encoding while estimating the color, differentiating RGB loss with respect to pose parameters would also require differentiating this positional encoding function, and differentiating it would lead to bias towards high frequency feature. Therefore, we propose a modified positional encoding function, which on differentiation can mitigate this effect of high bias towards high frequency features. Given the all the modules, we now discuss the complete pipeline for our method. So, given an initial set of multi-scale images along with noisy poses, we use multi-scale representation for neural radiance fields and rotation averaging for robust pose estimation to arrive at a color and volumetric density for any 3D point. And then by applying the volume rendering technique of neural radiance fields, we get the rendered image, and then calculating the loss from this rendered image, we update both the pose network parameters and structure network parameters to learn the scene along with robustifying the poses, and finally we are able to obtain a robustified set of poses along with the correctly learned 3D scene representation. We now discuss the results of this proposed approach on the multi-scale version of the Blender dataset with noisy set of poses. It can be observed that there are no artifacts in our renderings, whereas the renderings of MIPNERF are completely distorted, and thereby showing its effectiveness under pose perturbations. And this is true for all the images, all the scenes in the multi-scale Blender dataset. We further perform a numerical comparison of our approach with respect to the existing baselines, involving the baselines that have integrated neural radiance fields with pose optimization procedures like BARF and NURF minus minus. We further define three new baselines, which combine the multi-scale representation with these pose optimization schemes for pose in the BARF and NURF minus minus, and we observe that none of these baselines can reconstruct correct 3D scene in the multi-scale Blender dataset with perturbed poses, whereas our approach is able to correctly model it, thereby showing its effectiveness when both the issues are present simultaneously, that is multi-resolution or multi-scale images along with noisy set of poses. We further show some results on the original Blender dataset. Finally, we discuss the effectiveness of our approach in a real-world scenario where we use a large-scale reconstruction dataset, 3D reconstruction dataset, the tanks and temples dataset, and we use a truck sequence of this dataset with the following pose trajectory and an example subset of images. Now we observe the reconstruction results, where we can see that there is a slight difference in the reconstructed renderings of our approach and MIPNERF, where our approach is a little better than the MIPNERF, and the difference is not very high because a lot of poses are available for this, a lot of images are available for this scene, and therefore there would be a dense set of key point correspondences, and so this will result in less noise in pose estimation. But still, under this dataset, our approach is still better, somewhat better renderings in MIPNERF. Finally, to simulate a realistic case, we use our smartphone and move around the scene and capture the scene at different points sampled randomly. So we move around a black box and capture it from various viewpoints in a random fashion, and this is a subset of images for that black box. This is the proximate Coulomb trajectory for this scene, and we see that it is highly jiggering, and not a dense correspondence would be available in this case. And we see that MIPNER struggles to perform in such cases because the poses estimated by any SVM algorithm would be very noisy for such cases. Whereas on the other hand, our approach is still able to recover the approximately correct structure for this, and it shows decent renderings for this scene, thereby showing its effectiveness in any real world situation where a lot of images might not be available and they get captured at different scales along with a noisy set of poses. Given the results we discussed, and the effectiveness of our approach can be proven, and it can be used to further boost research in the neural radiance fields literature. Thank you for the time.